Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to peel back the layers on complex global events to give you the context you really need to be well-informed.
Mm-hmm.
And today, we're doing a really critical deep dive. We're looking at a major foreign policy and military event that really dominated the headlines around Christmas of 2025.
That's right. We're talking about a significant U.S. military strike. It targeted militant groups in Nigeria's northwestern Sokoto state.
A big story.
A huge story. And our mission here, as always, is to give you a shortcut to understanding this complexity. We're not here to, persuade you one way or the other.
No, not at all.
Our main source for this is a really detailed report from the Associated Press. AP is, recognized globally for its commitment to factual, independent reporting, so we're starting from a solid base.
And what we want to do is perform an African-centered analysis. We want to explain why this matters on the ground, what does it tell us about Nigeria's internal security, and maybe most importantly, how do these external narratives, these big headlines, actually shape how the conflict itself is defined?
That's the core of it.
Absolutely. The AP report, it was published right in the middle of the holiday season, and it details this pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy in Africa. The core message, and this is what immediately set the global framing, was the announcement from the U.S. president.
Yep. He announced a powerful and deadly strike against Islamic State targets.
And the framing was just so specific. It was explicitly presented as a response to the persecution of Christians.
And that framing, that's really where the narrative war begins. It immediately created this stark conflict between how the event was presented to the world and how the Nigerian government felt it needed to be understood, for its own people and for the region.
So that's what we're going to unpack. We'll look at that narrative conflict. We'll explore the reality of what insecurity actually looks like in Nigeria's northwest.
We'll also analyze the complex power dynamics that led up to the strike.
And we'll highlight the crucial context that was just, completely missing from those sensational headlines. This is a deep dive into security, into sovereignty, and the real power of defining the narrative. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The first thing that really jumps out is just the sheer disparity in how this military action was characterized.
It's night and day.
Completely. Between the two governments involved, the U.S. and the Nigerian federal government. Let's start with the basic facts of the action itself, which seem pretty straightforward.
Right. So, fact number one. The U.S. launched airstrikes. The target was identified as Islamic State forces, and the location was Nigeria's Sokoto state. That's the military event in a nutshell.
And what's really critical to establish right at the start is the cooperation element, because when you just hear U.S. strike, it can sound unilateral.
That's a great point. And it often gets obscured in the reporting that focuses only on the big U.S. announcement. This was not an invasion. It wasn't a surprise attack.
It was coordinated.
The strikes were explicitly carried out with Nigeria's cooperation, and, crucially, they had the formal approval of the Nigerian government.
So this wasn't an act of military overreach. This was strategic coordination.
Exactly. Nigeria's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they came out and confirmed it. They confirmed an exchange of intelligence and strategic coordination with the U.S.
And I bet they were careful with their language.
Oh, very. They made sure to emphasize that this cooperation was consistent with international law and, this is the key phrase, founded upon a mutual respect for sovereignty.
That detail is absolutely vital for the Nigerian government, isn't it?
It's everything. It means they were partners in the action, not just a passive location or, worse, a victim of foreign intervention. It's about agency.
It makes perfect sense. They have to assert control over their own territory, even when they're accepting foreign help.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets complicated, right? The motivations.
Right. Well, why?
The motivations for the strike, as articulated by the U.S. side, are completely different from the Nigerian diplomatic position. Let's look at the U.S. claimed motivation first.
Okay. And we have to treat this as what it is. A political interpretation. It's a message tailored for a very specific audience, and it was defined right from the top, from the highest political office.
The president himself.
President Trump stated the target was militants who have been targeting and viciously killing primarily innocent Christians. The wording is so precise. Primarily innocent Christians.
And this wasn't just a one-off line in a press release. It was amplified powerfully.
It really was. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in particular, he used platforms like X to just hammer this interpretation home. He explicitly linked the timing of the strike to Christmas.
To Christmas.
Yeah. And the goal, he said, was ending the killing of innocent Christians. I mean, the framing is intensely specific, it's politically powerful, and it leverages this narrative of religious protection that resonates really deeply within a particular U.S. domestic political context.
It simplifies a hugely complex security challenge down to a single, highly emotional vector, a good versus evil narrative.
That's it. So by framing it this way, the action becomes immediately understandable, immediately legible to a U.S. audience. It provides a clear moral justification for what is actually a very expensive and logistically complex intervention, thousands of miles from U.S. shores.
Okay, so that's the U.S. narrative.
Right.
Clear, simple, powerful. Now let's contrast that with the Nigerian government's counterframing.
And this represents their verified official diplomatic position, and it was a very direct pushback against that simplification from the U.S.
So what did they say? How did they counter it?
Nigeria's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they countered that singular faith-based focus. They stated very clearly that terrorist violence in any form, whether directed at Christians, Muslims, or other communities, remains an affront to Nigeria's values.
So they broadened the scope immediately. They insisted on a non-sectarian view.
Exactly. It's a national issue, not a sectarian one.
I wonder if we should pause on that for a second. Is there any evidence in the source that the Nigerian government genuinely feels this way? Or is this just, the kind of diplomatic boilerplate you have to say to protect your international image, to stop internal divisions from getting wider?
That is the absolute critical question when you analyze diplomatic language.
Yeah.
And the answer is it's probably both. But there is a historical precedent here. The Nigerian government has consistently asserted that people of many faiths have suffered attacks in Nigeria.
Right.
For them, acknowledging that extremist groups, look at Boko Haram and its offshoots, they target Muslims they deem apostates or not Muslim enough. That's a crucial fact for maintaining national cohesion.
So if they just accept the U.S. framing that this is only about Christian persecution,
they risk alienating a huge portion of their own population, the vast majority of Nigerians, both Christian and Muslim, who are suffering under this broader umbrella of instability.
So the distinction is absolutely crucial. The U.S. saw a politically useful faith-based intervention. Nigeria insisted it be viewed as a comprehensive national security issue that impacts their entire populace.
That is the core narrative conflict. And what's so fascinating here is what this divergence tells us about global power dynamics. The power to define the problem, it often sits with the intervening external power, doesn't it?
It really does. The U.S. emphasized religious persecution. Nigeria insisted on national security. And that divergence is it's so crucial for understanding who actually holds power in defining a conflict on the world stage.
Because when a foreign power intervenes, even with your approval, their justification, their narrative, can drastically simplify a complex reality for their own political gain back home.
And when that framing is simplified down to a single religious vector, the solution offered often gets simplified too. It just focuses on the symptom, the militant group, and not the underlying structural causes that keep this instability alive.
Precisely. Which really compels us to look at the reality on the ground.
Exactly. This is where it gets really, really interesting. To understand the magnitude of this strike, we need to locate it within Nigeria's vastness. We're talking about a nation of over 220 million people.
It's huge.
And it's split, roughly, between Christians who are the majority in the south and Muslims who form the majority in the north. So when international reports say Islamic State in Nigeria, most listeners, I think, immediately think of the familiar terror groups.
They think of Boko Haram. Or more accurately these days, its more dominant successor, ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province.
Right. And those groups are historically and primarily active where?
In the northeast, near Lake Chad. They're the ones causing massive displacement and conflict in states like Borno and Yobe. That's been the sort of traditional epicenter of this conflict for years.
But this strike, this U.S. strike, was not in the northeast. It was in Sokoto State, which is far to the northwest.
A completely different region.
And that suggests we're dealing with a different element of the security challenge altogether.
That is a crucial geographical distinction. It's so important. Security analysts who are quoted in the source material, they believe the U.S. target was likely a lesser-known group called the Lakurawa Group.
The Lakurawa Group.
Yes. And they are prominent in these northwestern states like Sokoto and Kebbi. So we have to immediately, incorporate the profile of this specific group into our understanding. It's not just a generic IS affiliate.
So what defines the Lakurawa Group? And why are they suddenly a priority target now?
Well, unlike the massive kind of established operational structure of ISWAP in the Northeast, the Lakurawa Group operates in very specific, often remote regions.
How do they do that?
The source notes that they exploit these large swaths of forests that connect different states. They use them as hideouts, and that makes them incredibly difficult to track with conventional ground operations.
And they become more dangerous recently.
Yes, increasingly lethal just in the last year or so, specifically in that northwestern corridor. They've been targeting remote farming communities and security forces with devastating efficiency.
And what's the most significant detail about their profile? What makes them different from, say, just bandits?
This is the pivotal fact. They are identified as an ideologically driven group. And more than that, they are reported to be controlling territories in Sokoto and Kebbi.
Controlling territory. That's a huge step up.
It changes everything. For you, the learner, controlling territory means they are actively replacing the state. They're collecting protection fees, what they call taxes. They are enforcing their own brutal laws. They're administering their own form of justice in areas where the official government simply cannot reach.
So this moves them beyond mere banditry into a full-fledged, governance-challenging insurgency. They're acting like a proto-state.
That's a perfect way to put it, a proto-state. And that immediately leads us to the structural root cause that's identified in the source, the near absence of the state.
This is the lived reality for millions of ordinary Africans who are caught in these conflict zones. It's not just that the militants are strong, it's that the governance structure is weak or sometimes just completely non-existent in those hotspots.
A Nigerian security researcher, Malik Samuel, he works for an organization called Good Governance Africa, and he places the blame for the rise of these violent extremist groups in the Northwest squarely on this structural failure.
What were his words?
He noted the near absence of the state and security forces in hotspots. I mean, for anyone who wants an African-centered analysis, that is the core insight. The vacuum.
So when we talk about state absences, we're talking about a systemic retreat. The police aren't there, the judiciary is defunct, schools are closed, public services like clinics just don't exist.
Exactly. And into that vacuum, organized, ideologically driven groups like Lakurawa can just fill the space. They offer a brutal form of control and predictability that supersedes any authority from Abuja.
It's a fundamental breakdown of the social contract between the state and its citizens.
It is. And the U.S. strike, as effective as it might be tactically in the short term, is really just a high-tech Band-Aid. It's being applied to this profound, endemic structural issue, the inability of the Nigerian state to project power, governance, and security consistently to its own periphery.
And we really have to emphasize that this strike, this one event, it only addresses one facet of Nigeria's massive internal conflict. It's not the whole story.
Not even close. Nigeria is fighting a multi-front war. And so much more complicated than the simple binary of terrorist versus government that we often get in the media.
We absolutely need to dedicate some time to this complexity because the media simplification can be, well, just dizzying.
Yeah.
The violence in Nigeria is not monolithic.
Not at all. The source material implicitly acknowledges this. It's a vast, interwoven tapestry of instability. And it's driven by at least 5 distinct and often overlapping categories of attacks.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's start with the one the U.S. chose to focus on.
Right. First, there is religiously motivated violence. This is the narrative the U.S. highlighted. And to be clear, this absolutely involves the brutal targeting of Christians. That is a fact.
But it's more complex than that.
It's much more complex because these same extremist groups like ISWAP and its ilk, they also aggressively target Muslims. They target any Muslim they deem to be deviating from their own rigid ideology.
So many of the greatest victims of groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP are actually fellow Muslims in the North.
Staggering numbers. So the U.S. framing, by focusing exclusively on Christians, it minimizes the suffering of a significant portion of the Nigerian population who are victims of the exact same ideological violence.
Okay, that's the first front. What's the second major one?
The second front is one that's increasingly recognized as being driven by environmental factors. It's the clashes between farmers and herders.
This is a huge issue across the entire Sahel region, not just Nigeria.
It is, and it pits primarily settled agricultural communities against nomadic or semi-nomadic cattle herders. Fundamentally, it is an ecological and economic struggle. It's a fight over dwindling arable land and water resources.
And that's being made worse by climate change and rapid population growth.
Exactly. So here we're not talking about ideology, we're talking about survival, about resource scarcity. And that is a problem that is much, much harder to resolve with a military strike.
A drone can't create more water or fertile land. Okay, third category of violence.
Third, we have communal rivalries. These are often very localized, historical conflicts between different ethnic or sub-ethnic groups.
And what do they fight over?
Usually issues like land boundaries, local political appointments, or control over economic assets like a local market. And while these clashes might not generate international headlines, they contribute massively to the general atmosphere of instability. They just erode local trust in state institutions.
It shows the sheer challenge of governance. It's not just managing the big terrorist groups, it's managing thousands of these small, simmering local disputes. What about political movements?
That's the fourth category. We have organized secessionist groups. These are particularly active in the South,
Right, like in the Biafra region.
primarily advocating for regional autonomy or, in some cases, the outright breakup of the Nigerian state. This is usually due to a sense of historical marginalization or economic disenfranchisement.
And their motives are overtly political, right? They're focused on the structure of governance, not religious extremism.
Correct. And that often leads to direct clashes with federal security forces. It's a completely different kind of conflict.
And the last category you mentioned.
The fifth is ethnic clashes. And these are tied less to secession or land, though there's always overlap, and more to outright competition for political power within Nigeria's complex federal structure.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A contest over who should hold a specific local or state-level office can rapidly devolve into violent confrontations when political mobilization happens along ethnic lines. It's about power and representation.
So if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, the U.S. strike, while it might have been tactically successful against the Lakurawa group, it really only addresses one symptom.
One symptom within this vast interwoven tapestry of instability.
It's like trying to drain one small puddle when the entire plumbing system of the house is broken.
That's a great analogy, and that's the danger of an external intervention that prioritizes a single ideologically driven target. The root causes, resource scarcity, decades of governance failure, historical rivalries, environmental pressure, they are completely untouched by a drone strike in Sokoto.
So the external focus risks neglecting the very complexity that keeps Nigeria in this permanent crisis mode. It prioritizes a quick, media-friendly win over the tedious, necessary long-term work of structural reform.
It does, and that brings us to the power dynamics.
Yes. This deep dive reveals a really complex layer of foreign pressure that was building up to this strike. I mean, military action is rarely an isolated event, is it?
Almost never. It's often the culmination of months, sometimes years, of diplomatic leverage and policy designations. They're designed to force a partner's hand.
So what were the mechanisms the U.S. used leading up to this strike? And who ultimately holds the power to dictate the terms of this kind of intervention?
The U.S. policy precursors, as the source lays them out, show a clear, deliberate escalation of pressure against the Nigerian government. And they use legal and diplomatic tools long before any physical strike occurred. The first tool was the IRFA designation.
IRFA, that's the International Religious Freedom Act. So the U.S. designated Nigeria a country of particular concern, or CPC.
Exactly. And that designation is a very big deal. Under IRFA, being named a country of particular concern means the U.S. officially believes that Nigeria either engages in or tolerates systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom.
That's not just a diplomatic slap on the wrist. That carries some serious political weight.
It does. It triggers consequences. It empowers the U.S. president to take specific actions. These can include sanctions, withholding foreign aid, withdrawing diplomatic support,
Or, as we saw here, ramping up military planning.
Right. The designation signals to the entire world that the U.S. views Nigeria as failing in its basic duty to protect its citizens' religious rights. And that places immense pressure on Abuja's international standing.
And that designation translated directly into concrete, actionable threats, didn't it?
Yes. The source confirmed that, either following or concurrent with this political pressure, President Trump had ordered the Pentagon the previous month to begin planning for potential military action.
So the threat was made explicit.
Very. And on top of that, the State Department announced visa restrictions. These were for Nigerians and their family members who were deemed to be involved in killing Christians there.
Now, that is a highly sophisticated and targeted pressure mechanism.
It's very effective.
Because instead of broad economic sanctions that can hurt everyone, visa restrictions hit the Nigerian elite. Politicians, military leaders, wealthy business people. They hit them where they and their families have significant personal interests.
Access to education in the U.S.,
Yeah.
healthcare, leisure, banking.
It creates this powerful internal leverage. The elite class, whose ability to travel and maintain international connections is vital to them, suddenly has a very direct incentive to cooperate with U.S. demands on religious freedom and security policy.
So this combination of severe condemnation, the CPC designation, followed by a military threat, and then these targeted sanctions, it creates immense diplomatic leverage. It essentially forces the Nigerian government toward a choice.
Accept foreign military assistance on U.S. terms, or face severe, personally impactful diplomatic fallout.
And that brings us to this delicate tightrope walk of accountability and sovereignty. You can see how much pressure they were under in Nigeria's official response. They were so painstakingly careful, asserting that cooperation was based on mutual respect for sovereignty.
They needed the help. They needed the foreign intelligence and the precision firepower that, frankly, only a military like the U.S. can provide to fight a group like Lakurawa that controls territory. But at what cost?
The cost is resisting the narrative. They have to accept this help, but without completely succumbing to the U.S. framing that narrative that Nigeria is an unstable state needing an external savior, specifically for one religious group.
They have to protect the perception of their own governance and control. They have to demonstrate to their own citizens and to the entire region that they are still in charge, even when they're coordinating these strikes.
Because if they don't assert their sovereignty, the international narrative becomes permanently simplified. And Nigeria starts to look like a passive recipient of aid, rather than an active, dignified partner fighting its own complex internal struggle.
And we have to look at the context of the U.S. footprint in Africa more broadly.
That's a really important point. The source notes that the U.S. security footprint has actually been diminishing across the continent.
Yeah.
Military partnerships have been scaled down or even canceled in other areas. It reflects a trend of U.S. retrenchment, or at least shifting priorities.
So the detail that they had to draw forces from other parts of the world, as the source notes, that's not insignificant.
Not at all. It underscores the high logistical cost and the extraordinary nature of this intervention into Sokoto State. This wasn't a simple deployment from an existing, well-staffed base in Africa.
It required a significant mobilization.
A huge one. And that suggests that the domestic political justification in the U.S. protecting Christians during Christmas was powerful enough to overcome the usual bureaucratic and logistical hurdles that often slow down or prevent interventions in Africa.
Okay, let's turn to the cost-benefit analysis of all this. Who benefits and who bears the cost of this complex exchange of sovereignty for firepower?
The immediate tactical benefit, well, that accrues directly to the residents of Sokoto and Kebbi states.
The people on the ground.
Yes. When your security forces are overwhelmed and groups like Lakurawa are controlling your villages, the instantaneous removal of an active, lethal threat, even if it's only temporary, brings undeniable short-term security and relief. That is the clearest positive outcome for Africans on the ground.
But the costs, they seem to be distributed far more broadly, and they often target people who had nothing to do with the conflict.
Precisely. Ordinary, innocent Nigerians and their families could bear the cost of those U.S. visa restrictions. While they're aimed at pressuring elites, they can function as a form of collective punishment or just broad policy application, complicating the lives of many uninvolved citizens.
And what about the more structural cost?
The main cost, I think, is the reinforcement of a global narrative that drastically simplifies and misrepresents Nigeria's security challenges.
And what does that structural cost look like in practice? How does it play out?
It means that future foreign policy decisions, future aid packages, future investment, they are all less likely to target the complex, structural, long-term issues.
Like governance reform, or climate adaptation for farmers, or local police training.
All of those things. Instead, the foreign focus will likely remain on providing these selective military interventions that just fail to address the underlying economic and political root causes. The cost is having Nigeria's complex reality reduced to a soundbite that perfectly serves a foreign political agenda. And that erosion of complexity can be very, very expensive for national stability in the long run.
Every deep dive teaches us that a news story is really just a snapshot, isn't it? And often the most critical elements, the context, the history, the human reality, are the ones left out of the frame.
They almost always are.
So what does this specific AP report omit? What's missing that would be essential for you, the learner, to be truly informed?
Well, we have to acknowledge the significant information gaps in the coverage. While the AP report is factual about the diplomatic and political announcements, what the U.S. said, what Nigeria said, it focuses very heavily on the source of power, which is the justification coming out of Washington and Abuja.
So what are the specific factual omissions? What don't we know?
Crucially, details on the extent of the damage caused by the strikes. They were not provided by Trump. We lack a real battle damage assessment. We don't have a body count. We don't know about potential collateral damage. The precise operational effectiveness beyond the words powerful and deadly is unknown.
So operational transparency is often the first casualty of these politically motivated announcements.
Always. And even more significant, I would argue, are the missing voices.
The voices of the people who are actually affected.
Absolutely. We lack the immediate reaction, the first-hand perspective of the residents in Sokoto State, the victims, the local security forces, the people whose daily lives were defined first by the Lakurawa group's control and then by this foreign intervention.
Their perspective is entirely filtered. It's mediated through these diplomatic channels and official statements from the capital cities.
So the narrative becomes exclusively about the intentions of the powerful interveners, rather than the lived reality and the consequences for the people being intervened upon.
And that right there is the political significance of the omitted context.
That is the structural issue we see time and again in this kind of reporting. The mainstream framing prioritized the geopolitical justification, the protecting Christians narrative, over the deep structural and historical factors that are truly fueling instability in Nigeria.
We detailed those drivers earlier. The governance deficits, the resource conflicts, the local evolution of these militant groups.
All of those long-term, slow-burn issues, they just disappear when the focus becomes tactical and faith-based.
And by focusing on only one faith group as the primary target, the U.S. framing directly risks minimizing the suffering of millions of Muslims who are targeted by the very same extremist groups.
That is a critical piece of counter-narrative evidence that has to be included. If you're an extremist group like ISWAP, your ideological purity often means you see a larger portion of the local Muslim population as legitimate targets than you do Christians.
Wow.
Because Christians are simply considered infidels to be conquered. But fellow Muslims who don't subscribe to your rigid interpretation, they are apostates who must be purged. The sheer volume of Muslim victims in the north who reject the extremists' worldview is staggering.
So ignoring that fact, or downplaying the underlying economic and environmental drivers behind communal violence.
It's not just an error in reporting, it's a dangerous simplification. It risks exacerbating internal Nigerian divisions by lending credence to a purely sectarian view of the conflict, which is exactly what the extremists want.
This pattern of highly selective intervention, it really leads us to consider some broader global parallels. We see this dynamic play out across many regions, not just in Nigeria.
It raises a really important question for us to think about. Does this pattern of intervention driven by immediate politically salient motives, like protecting a religious minority or getting a temporary tactical win, does it truly address the long-term structural security deficits that plague large African nations?
You can look at the Sahel, you could look at parts of the Horn of Africa. Foreign powers frequently intervene to address the immediate symptoms, a specific terror group, for example.
But they do it without investing in the painstaking, expensive, long-term work of building governance, institutional reform, or climate adaptation.
So the U.S. strike in Sokoto is a specific, and by all accounts, technically successful incident. But the pattern is one of foreign intervention being highly selective, often tied to domestic political signaling in the intervening country.
And ultimately avoiding the difficult structural work that's necessary for any kind of lasting peace. The problem is structural, the solution being offered is tactical, and until that fundamental imbalance is corrected, these states will remain dependent on foreign firepower to manage the crisis that the absence of their own state created in the first place.
Okay, to make sure you, the learner, walk away from this fully equipped, let's synthesize the key terminology and the big questions raised by this deep dive. This is where we really cement the knowledge we've gained by analyzing this complex event.
Let's do it. Let's start with a few simple explanations of the key terms that were just central to understanding the leverage dynamics and the local geography here.
First, that political designation we discussed, IRFA and CPC.
Right. IRFA stands for the International Religious Freedom Act. It's a U.S. law that gives the State Department the power to designate countries as a country of particular concern, or CPC.
Now, what does that do?
It means they're accused of engaging in or tolerating severe religious freedom violations. And critically, this designation moves the issue from just a humanitarian concern to a political tool. It empowers the U.S. to deploy policy consequences, including sanctions or, as we saw here, military planning.
Okay. Next, the two key terror groups.
Right.
Let's start with the one that was not the primary target of this specific strike, ISWAP.
ISWAP is the Islamic State West Africa province. This is the major, highly sophisticated extremist group that's active primarily in Nigeria's northeast, around the Lake Chad